Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 807, and today is June 6th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to talk about on today's show, so I'm going to jump right into it. Just want to remind people to subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone show. We are just, I think, like 94 subscribers away from hitting the 1,000 mark, which is going to allow us to do more with that channel, produce more content. And so if you guys could head on over and help us get over that finish line, it would really help us out. If the number of subscribers we have on this channel is certainly big enough to get those numbers up over there. And yeah, a lot of great stuff on that channel. I definitely recommend checking out the interview I did on Monday with Dr. Feroz Sidwa on his time in Gaza. All right, let's get into the stories that I have today, starting off with this one I wrote for the Institute on June 4th. Risk of escalation with Russia going way up due to Ukrainian attacks. President Donald Trump's special envoy to the Ukraine conflict said that the recent Ukrainian attacks on Russian air bases have created a significant risk of escalation in the war. So this is what Keith Kellogg said on Fox News. I'm telling you, the risk levels are going way up. I mean, what happened this weekend, people have to understand in the national security space, when you attack an opponent's part of their national survival system, which is their triad, the nuclear triad, that means the risk level goes up because you don't know what the other side is going to do. You're not sure. On Sunday, the Ukrainian intelligence service, the SBU, launched a major attack on Russian air bases thousands of miles from the front lines. Kiev claims to disabled one-third of Moscow's fleet of strategic bombers. Washington and Moscow each possess the ability to conduct nuclear attacks via bombers, submarines, and land-based ballistic missiles, known as the nuclear triad. The White House claims that it was not informed of the attack by Kiev. However, the CIA is deeply tied to the SBU. The SBU has conducted other provocative attacks in recent days, hitting Russian railways and bridges and reportedly killing 7 civilians. Trump said he spoke with the Russian President Vladimir Putin about the attacks on Wednesday. He said, Trump wrote on Truth Social, "I just finished speaking by telephone with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. The call lasted approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. We discussed the attack on the Russians' airplanes by Ukraine and various other attacks have been taking place by both sides. It was a good conversation, but not a conversation that will lead to an immediate peace. President Putin did say, and very strongly, that he will have to respond to recent attacks on the airfields." And so a couple things I just kind of want to get down and break down here. On the attacks, it does appear that the attacks weren't quite as significant as initially reported by Kiev. I think maybe, looking at some of the current numbers and videos I've been able to put together, a dozen or so of the Russian nuclear bombers receiving some damage appears to be a more accurate number than the 41 that Ukraine initially put out. Still, this is an attack on one of the legs of Russia's nuclear triad, and certainly if there was an attack on, the U.S. ballistic missile silos, the U.S. warplanes, that we would see a major response from Washington. Now, there has been some criticism of Russia here, and some deservedly so, right? Like, Putin did start this war, and now the chickens are coming home to roost to some degree with these attacks going on inside of Russian territory, hitting Russian air bases. However, looking at this in the bigger picture, it is important to understand that the reason that Russia's bombers were just sitting out on the tarmacs like that is because of a provision in the New START treaty. Now, even though Russia and the U.S. are technically not in the New START treaty anymore, they are both still within the parameters of that agreement. And so, they said they've walked away from it. It is set to expire next year, but at the same time, they are still complying with the provisions in the New START treaty, which is really important, because if they don't, then it's going to be a hell of a lot harder to get any kind of arms control agreement, where if everybody's already complying with parts of the arms control agreement, then it's going to be much easier to implement. And so the New START treaty required, and this is a verification measure, right, to make sure that Russia or the United States aren't plotting, preparing a major attack on the other party. If you have all of your nuclear bombers out in the open, it's very easy to see. Are you loading nuclear weapons on them? Are you moving them and positioning them different for strategic reasons, right? And this gives both sides comfort and confidence that the other side isn't going to conduct a surprise nuclear attack. It's a measure that reduces the nuclear tensions and also how close we are to actually breaking out into a nuclear conflict. And so for that reason, I think this attack is particularly provocative and dangerous, because from the Russian perspective, my guess is they feel quite a bit like they got screwed or scammed or played here when they were agreeing with a treaty with the United States. They were taking measures to ensure arms control, and then an American ally, if not the US and Western intelligence agencies themselves, exploited that to then attack the Russian bases. I find this to be deeply concerning and deeply troubling. Now, there is a lot of discussion around, because people have criticized this. I've criticized this attack, that, well, Russia started this war. And that certainly is the case. I'm not saying that Ukraine, or even with U.S. support, shouldn't have carried out this attack because it wasn't justified or moral or however you want to say it. The reason that this attack is problematic is a few reasons. One, Ukraine is backed by the West. And so, again, if Trump, say, invades Mexico, going after the drug cartels, the Mexican government doesn't like it, and Russia starts backing, or China starts backing Mexico, and then Mexico carries out an attack in the U.S. on a U.S. airbase. Certainly that would be justified, right? But understanding the geopolitical ramifications of that, it would be incredibly stupid and dangerous, right? Like, this is a direct provocation in the eyes of the Kremlin, and I think in reality too, on the West, MI6, the CIA, against Russia. And then also from the Ukrainian perspective, this attack, I doubt, is going to have a major impact on the war. The attack, say, on the Kerch Bridge or on the bridges in the bordering regions, I think you could reasonably argue would probably, or could at least have a impact on the Russian logistics and the ability for them to get the military equipment they want to the positions they want it in a timely manner. And so at least then, from the strategic Ukrainian standpoint, I think you could reasonably argue that attacking the bridges, and look, one of those bridges attacks killed 7 civilians. At the same time, I have a hard time, just going, oh, that's a civilian target. That target did have military value and is probably a part of the Russian plan to ramp up the war against Ukraine. And so to attack those railways, even if it's a civilian target, I think it's a far more sensible target for Ukraine to hit, because it could really impact the conflict. Here, I think this is going to cost Ukraine a lot of money. I think in London, in Brussels, in Washington, in the Pentagon, I'm sure they are assessing and they're celebrating and they're saying, oh, here, this has tipped the balance of the nuclear power, the strategic balance between the U.S. and Russia in the Western favor a little bit. This is going to cost Russia a lot of money to fix these problems. They're probably going to have to retool and do a lot of work to get these bombers and be able to even manufacture the parts needed for these bombers. And so I'm sure in some ways it's a real win for the West, but for Ukraine, I think they're just going to pay a massive price across for this. And so that gets us to Putin's statement here. What he told Trump is that there will be a strong response to the attack. I find Trump's statement here interesting. My guess is that he's trying to get out in front of this because there's going to be a lot of pressure on the U.S. to respond to the Russian response. And Trump is able to say, well, this was a predictable response of the Ukrainian attack. I do think it probably lowers the political temperature for a response a little bit. Putin does seem mad about this. Last night, Thursday into Friday, there were major Russian attacks across Ukraine. I expect that to continue over the weekend, and it does seem that the Russian forces are taking more territory in Ukraine. One thing I would point out about the Russian response, and there's been a lot of speculation on what that would be, and I don't have any real insight onto how Russia may respond, but I would say past behavior may be a good indication. And in that case, if you look at how Russia has responded in the past to Western Ukrainian provocations, it hasn't been to really, I guess, do anything that isn't central to its main war aims. And so when Ukraine invaded Kursk, Russia didn't reposition a lot of their troops from the Donbass, from Kherson to Zaporizhia, troops that were on the offensive, to move them into Russian territory to carry out defensive operations and to win back the Russian territory. They kept moving ahead as planned. And I think, use some North Korean soldiers, and I'm sure pull some soldiers from other parts of Russia in order to fight in Kursk and to retake that territory. And so I guess my point here is that I would imagine whatever response that Russia issues, it's going to be in line with their current war objectives, which seems to be to take territory, but mainly bring about a collapse of the Ukrainian military. And so that's what I think we're going to see, maybe strikes on military headquarters, commanders, any kind of reserve positions, things like this. All right, next up here, moving on to the Middle East, where we had this article from Dave DeCamp, June 4th, antiwar.com. So the article, U.S. vetoes UN resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. The U.S. on Wednesday vetoed a resolution at the UN Security Council that called for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, the release of Israeli captives, and the unrestricted flow of humanitarian aid into the besieged Palestinian territory. The U.S. was the only member of the 15-member Security Council that did not vote in favor of the ceasefire. The resolution was introduced by the 10 non-permanent members of the Council: Algeria, Denmark, Greece, Guyana, Panama, Pakistan, South Korea, Sierra Leone, Somalia, and Slovenia. The 10 nations said in a joint statement, "We believe this text reflects the consensus shared by all Council members that the war in Gaza has come to an immediate halt. All hostages must be immediately and unconditionally returned to unconditionally released, and civilians in Gaza must not starve and must have full unimpeded access to aid." So the U.S. and the four other permanent members, Russia, China, the UK, and France, all have veto power on the Security Council. The Biden administration vetoed several Gaza-related resolutions at the Security Council, but Wednesday's vote marked the first time that the new Trump administration used this veto power to block a Gaza ceasefire resolution on Israel's behalf. And I think this is almost less notable than during the Biden administration, just because this is what you expect from the Trump administration policy. At least under Biden, there was some hope that maybe enough public pressure could force the U.S. not to do this at the UN Security Council, since it's such bad public relations, but there's no chance of seeing that under Trump. So the Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar said in a post on X that after the vote, he wanted to thank President Trump and the U.S. administration for standing shoulder to shoulder with Israel and vetoing this one-sided resolution in the UN Security Council. Dorothy Shea, the acting U.S. ambassador to the UN, said that any product that undermines our close ally Israel's security is a non-starter. She also claimed that the resolution would hurt diplomatic efforts that have failed to make progress due to Israel's refusal to end its genocidal war by committing to a permanent ceasefire. And look, this calls for a release of all the hostages, so obviously, if it was adopted, it wouldn't be problematic in that sense. Israel just doesn't want it because they don't want to end the genocide. They want to drive all the Palestinians out. And if you have to give them food, they won't leave. And so that's obviously Israel's plan. Also, this next story, I think we really do see Israel is trying to bring about the collapse of the Palestinian society in Gaza. So if you have like 10 starving people, right, and you got them all locked up in a cage, and you give like 2 days worth of food, a bunch of food in there, then there's a chance that everybody might share it and understand that, like, we could eat for the next couple of days. If you throw in a single sandwich and they're all starving, there's probably going to be a massive brawl over that sandwich because whoever gets it is the only person that's going to be able to eat. So that's essentially what Israel is doing here in Gaza. They're just trickling out small amounts of food. They're delivering it in chaotic ways. And it seems to me to be a very intentional attempt to bring about the downfall of Palestinian society, a breakdown society, fighting, looting, things like that is going to, one, I guess, give Israel justification to just attack and kill Palestinians and say, oh, they were fighting, so we had to fire warning shots, and then they start running and we had to kill some of them, these kind of things that we hear from Israel. But also, it's just going to make distribution of aid much, much harder, much less efficient. People are going to get less because, more is going to be lost, hoarded, things like this. And, it's just a real problem. When humanitarian aid agencies start to distribute aid in an area with famine, typically they try to flood the area with food and aid, not just because the people need it, but because that's the way to do it in a way where you're not going to have a massive amount of like rioting, looting, and things like that. So this next article from Dave is absolutely shocking. Israel is arming an ISIS-affiliated gang in southern Gaza. The Israeli opposition leader and former defense minister Avigdor Lieberman said on Thursday that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was arming a gang in southern Gaza that affiliated with ISIS, a charge that has been confirmed by Israeli officials. So this is what Lieberman said. The Israeli government is giving weapons to a group of criminals and felons identified with the Islamic State at the direction of the Prime Minister. To my knowledge, this did not go through approval by the cabinet. Lieberman compared the arming of the criminal gang to Netanyahu's previous strategy of propping up Hamas as a counter to the Palestinian Authority. He said, no one can guarantee that these weapons won't be directed at Israel. We have no way of monitoring or tracking them. An initial statement released by Netanyahu's office didn't deny the allegation. It said Israel is acting to defeat Hamas in various ways upon the recommendation of the heads of the security establishment. Later, Netanyahu confirmed that Israel has been arming clans in southern Gaza. On the advice of security officials, we activated clans in Gaza that oppose Hamas. This is only good and saves the lives of IDF soldiers. The publication of this only benefits Hamas, but Lieberman doesn't care. Now, this is huge for a couple reasons, and the obvious one is just Israel's admitting to arming the Islamic State. That seems to be a real problem. But the other one here is admitting that ISIS is the enemy of the Islamic State, or ISIS is the enemy of Hamas, right? This is the whole time there's been this conflation of Hamas with any other jihadist organization, when historically Hamas has been very opposed to other jihadist organizations and, kind of focuses their militarism on securing the freedom of Palestinians, or at least, that's their stated aim. So Israel's military source told the Times of Israel that Israel has been arming a group described as a criminal gang of jihadists led by Yasser Abu Shabab, a member of one of the largest clans in southern Gaza. Israel has been providing Abu Shabab's gang with Kalashnikov rifles, including some that were seized from Hamas. According to the Times, Hamas sources speaking with Lebanon's Al Akhbar newspaper said that members of Abu Shabab's gang belong to an extremist Salafist faction that has run-ins with Hamas. Abu Shabab's gang has been operating in Israeli-controlled areas of southern Gaza and has been involved in looting aid shipments. And so again, look, if you're Israel and your goal in Gaza is to make sure as little food gets in as possible, one of the ways that you could do that seems here to be that you could allow the aid in, but then arm up this group that's just going to steal the aid. And so there you go. Israel's like, well, we let the aid in and then it got stolen. We can't do anything about that, when obviously they can, because the groups that are stealing this aid, first of all, if there's an armed group in Gaza that's operating openly, certainly Israel could take them out if they wanted to. But the second point here is that not only do they not want to, but they gave them arms. So in an interview with the Washington Post, Abu Shabab admitted that his group takes from trucks, but claimed they don't touch food, tents, or supplies for children. According to a report in the New Arab, he is affiliated with Shada al-Sufi, another gang leader who was detained by Hamas in 2020 over an alleged murder. The report said that al-Sufi fled Gaza with the help of ISIS and returned following the start of Israel's genocidal war. Al-Shabaab, who was imprisoned by Hamas for drug trafficking before an Israeli airstrike allowed him to escape, recently released a video where he said his new armed group cleared eastern Rafah of Hamas fighters and Palestinians could return to the area, which is under control of the IDF. Yair Golan, another Israeli opposition leader and retired IDF general, slammed Netanyahu for arming the gang and posted on X. Netanyahu, who transferred billions to Hamas in cash suitcases based on a misguided notion that Hamas is an asset and that it would end up in flip-flops, is now promoting a dangerous new notion, arming a Gaza militia with ties to ISIS. Netanyahu is dangerous to Israel's security. Instead of a security deal, creating arrangements with a moderate Sunni axis and bringing back the hostages and security to Israeli citizens, he is creating a new ticking time bomb in Gaza. And so I guess, in a sense, that's the least of my concerns, that Netanyahu is propping up a terrorist group that could blow back at him. But, they do have control in Gaza, which is likely bad for the Palestinians. All right, here, poll: Americans, Europeans have negative view of Israel. I wrote this one for the Institute on June 5th. A new survey from the Pew Research found that the U.S. and several European countries, a growing number of adults, have negative views of Israel. Tel Aviv's image in the U.S. has declined through the 20-month onslaught in Gaza. In the U.S., 53% of Americans have a very unfavorable or somewhat unfavorable view of Israel, against 45% who had a positive view. Among Western nations, in the Netherlands, Spain, and Sweden, nearly 4 in 5 adults have a negative opinion of the Jewish state. Of the 24 nations polled, only Indians, Kenyans, and Nigerians have a positive view of Israel. Overall, 2 out of 3 people surveyed had a negative sentiment of Tel Aviv. In the U.S., there was the largest split between adults who identified themselves on the right or the left. Only 30% of Americans on the right said they had a negative view of Israel, compared to 77 respondents on the left. The margin was the widest of any country polled. A Pew poll released in April had a slightly tighter margin, finding that 69% of Democrats viewed Israel unfavorably, while only 37% of Republicans said the same. That survey found a wide split in the Republican Party, with 50% of American right-wing adults under the age of 50 expressing a negative opinion of Tel Aviv. Pew found that Israelis understand they are viewed unfavorably on the global stage. A majority of Israelis, 58%, said Tel Aviv was not respected around the world, compared to only 39% who viewed Israel as respected. Tel Aviv's public image has fallen in the U.S. and around the world, as many Israeli military have conducted a brutal operation in Gaza. Many top Israeli officials have called for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, stating that is the goal of the current operations, which is clearly the case. One update on Iran talks here. Iran's Ayatollah criticizes UN nuclear proposal, vows Tehran won't stop uranium enrichment. So on Wednesday, the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, criticized the U.S. nuclear proposal and vowed Tehran would never get rid of its nuclear enrichment program, saying the issue was none of the U.S.'s business. So this has been the Iranian position for some time. So in that way, this story isn't notable, but I think it is notable that the Ayatollah is coming out and making this statement only because, from the American perspective, what we're hearing from the Trump administration is that Iran can't enrich. And yet the Iranian government keeps moving forward with talks and at times saying they're going in a good direction. And so, I've really wondered if there's two separate messages that Trump is conveying. One is privately to the Iranians and one is publicly to the Americans. Now, I think we understand why that Trump may lie to the Americans here. It's not necessarily to the people. I think it's mostly to the Senate, where you have a large number of senators, Tom Cotton, Lindsey Graham on the Republican side, but also Chuck Schumer on the Democrat side, who are really opposed to Trump re-entering a deal similar to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. And with that opposition, and the more time they have in the lead up to pass bills and sanctions that would prevent this any kind of deal from getting done, I think it could present a problem. So I could see Trump trying to kind of really hide his position when it comes to the discussions with the with the Iranians, mainly from the U.S. political class, from Capitol Hill. That being said, the Ayatollah coming out and making this statement, I do wonder if the private position of the Trump administration is actually starting to reflect the public position. So this is just something to keep an eye on over the weekend. We'll probably be talking about more last week. Israel seems to be ramping up and threatening to expand its military operations in Lebanon. We had some major bombings of Beirut yesterday, and now Israel is saying they may go further. And last up here, Human Rights Watch calls for a war crimes probe into U.S. bombing of Yemeni fuel port. So this is something we initially covered on the show, the U.S. bombing of the fuel port, which I believe is the Raj Isa fuel port in Hadida, Yemen. And so a lot of civilians died, 84 civilians, 150 more injured. 49 of those were just workers, truck drivers, 2 civil defense workers, and 3 children were killed. So horrific attack that the U.S. was responsible for, that we, acknowledge that we carried out. A part of the month-long 1,000 airstrikes that the U.S. dropped on Yemen. This is about half of the civilians that were killed in this single incident. And so it would be great if I had any hope that we are going to get this probe to happen. Really doubt it under the Trump administration. It would be great if we had some mainstream media outlets, do a probe, and that way they really can hold, they not only have the resources to carry out the probe, but also then the access to the Trump administration to demand accountability. Maybe we see it, maybe we don't. I'm thinking it's unlikely, although they do really hate Trump over in the mainstream press. All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We'll be back with more shows of conflicts of interest and the Kyle Anzalone show next week. Additionally, today, coming up in just about an hour here, 1 p.m. Eastern time, I'm going to be recording with our old friend Craig Pasta Jardula, and I will definitely post that link on my Ets account. So be sure to follow me on Ets. I'm also creeping up on 9,000 followers, which would be a pretty cool milestone to hit sometime in the coming month. Thanks, everyone.